we now know that people with gambling disorders, they essentially process everything differently, from the anticipation of playing, to how they handle winning, to how they process losing, to how they shift their strategies while they're playing and gambling. So, of course, imagine if you're playing blackjack and then you start to lose. Many people would shift their strategies, maybe stop or change up how much they bet.
Or go back to the ATM.
Exactly. And so we're finding that women with gambling disorder, they don't shift as quickly. There's a really fascinating term I like, and that's loss aversion. You talked about that. So that's a natural, baked-in psychological skill we all have, which is when something bad happens, it hurts us, and then we start to think about not doing that activity again, right? So in gambling, you lose $500 on a Friday. You wake up Saturday. For folks without a gambling disorder, that hurts. They don't like that feeling. They say, you know what? Bad run, bad luck. That's enough for now. I don't need more gambling for a while. Loss aversion. I don't want to feel more pain, right? What we're finding is that men and women with certain types of gambling disorder, they wake up Saturday morning, they're like, you know what? I'm going to get it back today. Today, my luck's back. I'm going to reboot. I'm going to reload, and I'll get back to even today.
Some would call that optimism.
That's what I was
Some might
say.
call it optimism, right? And almost in a perverse way. It used to, when I was starting off, I used to think very absolute. Okay, what's different bad? What's different good? What are dopamine levels too high? Are they too low? And I've come to realize it's much, much more subtle than that. We're talking about push-pull and the very traits that led people to develop gambling disorder or addictive disorders. If you pivoted and turned it another way, could actually be really profoundly helpful at work or for society. And I really think that's helped destigmatize what a lot of patients feel when they say, oh my God, my brain's damaged. I say, no, your brain's different. You have a different way of viewing, processing, handling, and dealing with the world. And right now, that hasn't worked to your advantage, but we flip it around, and through treatment, we can get it to work toward your advantage. That's been a big shift in the addiction world, I think.
Welcome to the Better Brain Podcast, where we talk about all things brain health for anyone who has a brain or knows someone who does and wants to make it better.
Today's guest is Dr. Tim Fong. Dr. Fong is a psychiatrist here at UCLA. He is a preeminent figure in the field of addiction medicine. His extensive body of work and clinical practice are centered on gambling disorder, various substance use disorders, and other behavioral addictions.
Dr. Fong is widely recognized for his instrumental role in establishing the UCLA Gambling Studies Program, a pioneering initiative. A hallmark of his approach is the advocacy for a holistic, brain health-centric paradigm in addiction treatment, which seamlessly integrates pharmacological interventions with psychotherapeutic modalities and a fundamental lifestyle modification focus.
I think this is a topic that is particularly important considering the explosion of sports betting online, and it was a good one.
I think it's going to be awesome to hear how the brain is being leveraged in ways that we didn't even know possible with this new form of gambling.
All right, check it out. Sports betting has absolutely exploded over the last few years. And everywhere I look, someone seems to be like placing a bet on their phone. So I think logically, my mind just comes to gambling addiction.
Right.
And I'm so glad to have you on because you are the expert in gambling addiction, but then also addiction in general. So I hope to kind of discuss addiction and then eventually be more specific on gambling addiction. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
We're excited. We've got some fun clips that we want you to react to. But before we get there, I want to start at the top. What is addiction? Let's just define it and differentiate it from vice and other things along the spectrum to a real big problem.
That's a great question. And I know you're titled today Better Brain Podcast. It should be Better, B-E-T-T-O-R, Brain Podcast for today's purpose. So again, my name is Dr. Timothy Fong. I'm a professor of psychiatry. I've been here at UCLA since 1998. 4 years of residency, 2 years of addiction psychiatry fellowship, and after that, building the UCLA Gambling Studies program. Why I bring that up is in the mid-'90s when I went to medical school, addiction was seen as a matter of willpower, a matter of self-control. You had to hit rock bottom. You had to want to get better. Choice. In 1995, National Institute on Drug Abuse came out and said, no. Through the power of neuroscience, we've now determined that addiction as we know it is a, quote, brain disease, meaning there are changes in structure and function of the brain as a direct result of exposure to substances or behaviors that have created changes in the brain that create the symptoms of disease of addiction. Inability to stop despite harmful consequences. So addiction as a word is funny because it doesn't have scientific criteria. We all know when we hear, we know what we mean. Oh, someone who's in an unhealthy relationship with a activity and continues to do that activity despite harmful consequences. One of our presidents famously said at one point, Saddam Hussein is addicted to weapons of mass destruction. Did he have tolerance? Did he have withdrawal? Did he have cravings?
Did he have them?
Did he have them? So we use that term all over. In fact, driving up Westwood Boulevard today, I see a billboard for a TV show that's just thrilling and addicting. So the word addiction doesn't always have to be, quote, a bad thing. It really highlights someone who has a deep, deep passion for an activity and continues to do that activity despite all sorts of circumstances. Now, in my mind, I'm an addiction psychiatrist. We don't call ourselves addictionologists like you fancy neurologists or gastroenterologists. We are addiction psychiatrists, but we also don't call ourselves substance use disorder physicians. It doesn't work. So we tend to put this into a broad bowl and call it the field of addictive disorders, which predominantly relates to substances and behaviors. Again, when people get over-involved in it to the point where it causes harmful consequences, and they still keep on doing it.
Yeah, I think an important distinction is probably that line between an addiction and, maybe a bad habit or whatever else you would call it. What is that?
Yeah,
exactly?
As I've gotten older, I'm trying to get more simple. There's just stuff we do every single day in our lives that just affect our bodies, both good or bad. A habit is just something I continually do every day without really thinking about it. Brushing my teeth, parking my car, tying my shoelaces. It doesn't really have a longer impact on what I do. A hobby or a passion are things I constantly want to do because I really enjoy them. I like doing them. I like playing tennis. I like running. I like watching, sports. These are passions of mine that I like to do. Contrast that to what we call kind of risky activities. And excessively drinking, excessively using cannabis, not getting a lot of sleep, using a lot of nicotine and vaping, gambling too much, shopping too much, having unprotected sex. These are all, quote, risky activities, which could be hobbies or passions or things you do or different forms of entertainment. So that's why you pile it on all together. I really fold all these activities are essentially things that we need to do to either survive or things that we need to entertain ourselves. I think for too long, a lot of the addiction world has been just seen as people who've taken entertainment too far to the point where they develop harmful consequences.
Yeah. So do you think that addiction might only be limited to these risky activities, or can it be a little bit more broad than just those activities?
No, over the years, I've seen patients who've had, quote, addictions to non-substances that you're like, huh?
Right.
Like exercise,
Yeah.
food. I once saw a guy who was, quote, addicted to buying tractors. And he kept buying multiple tractors. And it created tremendous harm. Debt, fights with his spouse. He had difficulty, where's he going to store these things? Exactly, right? So it created real world problems. Yeah. And it wasn't an obsession where he's like, I have to do it, otherwise something bad's going to happen, which is an obsession. It was more like, I really want this. And I really have to have it, and I just can't stop myself from doing it. So, it's a fuzzy line. And for years, we've always said, well, we wish we had neuromarkers, biological markers, brain scans like you fancy neurologists do, to determine the difference between a brain who is, quote, addicted versus a brain who just really, really loves something. So back in the 90s, Alan Leshner of NIDA used to say that, there's a switch that you go from using casually, recreationally, without damage and harm, and the switch flips. Suddenly there are all these changes in dopamine neurons and various things like that. And it's a simplistic view. I think many of us still hold that to be partially true, but there's still a really big difference between someone who's engaged in this condition of addiction and suffering real life problems versus someone who just does a lot of risky things, but for the most part can function and do well.
Yeah.
The way I draw the line, again, for our patients that come in to see us, their lives are restricted, their lives are damaged, their quality of life is severely impacted by this behavior of taking substances or just behavior or whatever they're doing. And it's gone wrong to the point where it's not making their quality of life better, it's making their quality of life worse.
I hear a lot of people saying, I have an addictive personality. Mm-hmm. Is that a thing?
Not really. I mean, it sounds great. And for years, I mean, think about it. Did you learn about that in medical school?
No.
Were there actually lectures on that?
No.
And what we rework it is that we now know there are biological, psychological, and social risk factors that create addiction. On the biological side, that there are some genetic risk factors that lead people to become more likely to develop substance use disorder or other addictive disorders. Mm-hmm. There are certain personality traits, such as risk-taking, impulsivity, inability to deal with trauma and loss, things like that, competitiveness that probably lead to addiction. Mm-hmm. But a lot of my patients, when they say, I have an addictive personality, I say, no, you don't. You just have a personality. Mm-hmm. And you have certain personality traits that lead you to do activities over and over and over and over again and not stop. On the flip side, that's kind of, what else do we call that? A really good work ethic. Right. Someone who's detailed oriented, someone who's willing to stick through thick and thin, who's really resilient. So that term, again, is kind of a non-scientific. And I find it sometimes it makes it stigmatizing, right? Because then people will say, I was just born this way. I'm destined to be like this forever. I'm like, no, not really. We can change our lives and our various traits, moving forward all the time.
Can I push back against that? Because in the context that I've heard it in has been, I don't even want to involve myself in that because of my addictive personality. Right. What do you think about that?
Well, that's kind of like being aware of what your risk factors are.
Sure.
So if you know that you have those risk factors about if you get into something that's interesting, pleasurable, or rewarding, and there's potential damage from doing that activity over and over and over and over again, then you may say, you know what, I know my brain or my mind, if I get exposed to that, it'll be a very quick journey before I start doing this compulsively, nonstop, or at least, excessively and harmful.
Sure.
So, I'm thinking about a couple people who I know personally who've discussed this with me throughout their life. They describe gaps in their life, in their wellness, in their joy, in their fulfillment that have led them to fill those gaps, to feel normal with these activities that have high reward, or at least even in anticipation of winning or of getting whatever substance in. There's a fulfillment there, or at least an escape from what is not filled. But on the other end, as they've battled and started to fill gaps in the biopsychosocial categories that you talked about, feeling a sense of purpose and meaning, a sense of responsibility, accomplishment, and things like that in their life, a sense of connection. They've wanted and wanted less what they were seeking before, and felt more resilient to their previous vulnerabilities.
Right.
So are there certain risk factors, personality described, that lead towards this vulnerability?
There are, I'd go back again, when I was in medical school, first learning about addiction in the mid-90s, I went to the Betty Ford Center. So it's still a nationally recognized residential treatment program for substance use disorder and mental health. And there, one of the very first lectures I listened to, this lecturer said, people use substances for one of two reasons: to get high or to feel normal. And he said, on the latter, to feel normal means they're fulfilling something that's missing. It's missing in their brain, their body, or their mind. Yeah. And that substance or that activity, like gambling or exercise or watching pornography, gets them back to center for a little while. That's the proverbial, quote, self-medication hypothesis, the idea that you have untreated depression or ADHD or
anxiety,
bipolar disorder, and substances tend to be the medication you found quickly before you got FDA-approved medications. So it goes both ways, and that's how you explain that, quote, gap area. But on the other side, again, people just use it and get, quote, high, get an elevated experience, an altered experience because of substance. That's where we've now recognized that change does happen to the brain over time. So methamphetamine is a perfect example of that. So the very first time folks will use methamphetamine, they report a phenomenal response, euphoria, energy, sexual libido, and it lasts for several hours, right? Yeah. Mother Nature never intended for us to feel like that every single day. But then they start chasing that high over and over. And then after, 40, 50, 60 times using methamphetamine, you now start to create literally brain scars, damage that starts changing the tone of your brain, how your brain responds to normal pleasure, thus then creating the gap that then people feel when they don't have the drug. So the way I think about it is, you can, again, be born a certain way where you're, quote, missing certain things, where substances or highly activating activities make you feel normal, or B, just through using these substances over long stretches of time can create, again, profound changes in your brain and your mind that make you feel not normal when you're not using or engaged in that substance or activity.
Yeah.
So is addiction a modern issue? I mean, I get the sense that gambling, for example, has been around for a long time. What can you tell us about how it's evolved and whether it's on the rise or not? Is this a new thing?
So, interesting. Gambling's been around since the dawn of mankind. Obviously, it's stories of bones and caves and, dice, invented well before the time of Christ. Our nation's history is fascinating with gambling, right? Just the people who immigrated to America in the first wave are essentially incredibly high risk takers, right? And then think about all the cities and towns and states that were founded essentially by gambling, whether it be lotteries on the East Coast, the California gold rush. That's all gambling, right? And you go all the way back to this definition of what gambling is putting something of value, usually money or time, on an event of uncertain outcomes in the hopes of winning a larger reward. Now, modern day gambling tends to be games of chance.
Yep.
But again, we're in academics, right? It's the biggest gamble of all. Every time we submit a grant, it's a gamble. I put something of value, my time and effort, into a grant of uncertain outcome. I may or may not get funded in hopes of a larger reward. That's a gamble.
Yep.
So gambling by definition is something that's much larger part of us as humans. It's part of decision making, risk taking. It's part of play. It's part of what makes us push the envelope on inventions, on trying out different things. But it's also part of the entertainment of creating action and excitement around various life activities, which is probably why sports betting has always been a thing. Like whatever contests there have always been, whether it's the closest bone to the edge of the cave, there's people have always wanted to wager and bet on the outcome just to make that activity much, much more interesting.
Yeah. Can we take a tangent real quick on just uncertainty and our relationship with uncertainty?
Right.
I've heard it be the relationship that humans establish with uncertainty is what's allowed us to evolve to the place that we're at now. But I do wonder, there's a element of possibly even fear with uncertainty versus what you're saying. It's, in these instances, we're leaning into that uncertainty and getting a lot more out of it. I do wonder, what is that difference there, right?
Yeah.
There can be fear, there can be, reward within uncertainty. Like, what is that?
Well, you're all neurologists, right? I'm a psychiatrist. We speak the same language. We use different terms. For me, I think about what's interesting about gambling is that, why do people do it? I've had a lot of conversations with patients. I say, you know what? You could have just gotten a $20 an hour job and just done that, and in a few months be, quote, $2,000 up.
Right. Yep.
And they'd look at me and say, but that wouldn't be fun at all. And I said, so where's the fun? So in gambling, a lot of the fun, of course, is in the uncertainty of the outcome, is the idea that there's risk involved, and losing is the risk or fear of losing paradoxically is incredibly rewarding. There's dopamine associated with losing, there's action, there's adrenaline, there's anxiety. It's the same reason we love seeing horror movies, right? You're edge of the seat kind of stuff. So we're drawn to that. And I think that's such a natural survival instinct when you're at risk, when you might get attacked from around the corner and you don't know, but then you survive it. So these are all baked in neuro substrates and neuro circuitries that we just respond to the world that we live in. And so that's why I think all these things have then always been there, and now we've created a world that kind of taps those neurocircuits much quicker and faster than ever before.
Yeah. And that's a good point, this uncertainty piece. People have different risk aversiveness or willingness to take risks or to be comfortable in uncertainty and maybe even feel joy or some type of pleasure from going after something with an uncertain outcome. But is there a way to test that? Like, could you take, or maybe experiments have been done, somebody's reactions on blood sampling to an uncertain outcome during, the Wisconsin card sort task or some other Iowa gambling task that tells us if they're the type of person that's going to chase the dragon, just going to keep going after it?
Yeah, about 20 years ago, when I first started this, we started doing a lot of work in neuropsychological profiles on men and women with gambling behaviors. And back then, we were looking at things like not only Wisconsin card sorting and other impulse control tasks, delayed discounting, all these fancy measures. And essentially what it boiled down to is we started to see that people who already had pre-existing issues with decision-making, they prefer the impulsive moment. So think like that marshmallow test, right? Do you want one marshmallow right now, or do you want 2 marshmallows at 4 o'clock? Right? The kid or the person that prefers the immediate reward and delays the larger reward is considered a little bit more impulsive, and that they were considered to be more at risk for gambling behavior. And so that's played out a little bit. But what's really played out is we now know that people with gambling disorders, they essentially process everything differently, from the anticipation of playing, to how they handle winning, to how they process losing, to how they shift their strategies while they're playing and gambling. So, of course, imagine if you're playing blackjack and then you start to lose. Many people would shift their strategies, maybe stop or change up how much they bet.
Or go back to the ATM.
Exactly. And so we're finding that men and women with gambling disorder, they don't shift as quickly. There's a really fascinating term I like, and that's loss aversion. You talked about that. So that's a natural, baked-in psychological skill we all have, which is when something bad happens, it hurts us, and then we start to think about not doing that activity again, right? So in gambling, you lose $500 on a Friday. You wake up Saturday. For folks without a gambling disorder, that hurts. They don't like that feeling. They say, you know what? Bad run, bad luck. That's enough for now. I don't need more gambling for a while. Loss aversion. I don't want to feel more pain, right? What we're finding is that men and women with certain types of gambling disorder, they wake up Saturday in the morning, they're like, you know what? I'm going to get it back today. Today, my luck's back. I'm going to reboot. I'm going to reload, and I'll get back to even today.
Some would call that optimism.
That's what I was
Some might call it optimism, right? And almost in a perverse way. It used to, when I was starting off, I used to think very absolute. Okay, what's different bad? What's different good? What are dopamine levels too high? Are they too low? And I've come to realize it's much, much more subtle than that. We're talking about push-pull and the very traits that led people to develop gambling disorder or addictive disorders. If you pivoted and turned it another way, could actually be really profoundly helpful at work or for society. And I really think that's helped destigmatize what a lot of patients feel when they say, oh my God, my brain's damaged. I say, no, your brain's different. You have a different way of viewing, processing, handling, and dealing with the world. And right now, that hasn't worked to your advantage, but if we flip it around and through treatment, we can get it to work toward your advantage. That's been a big shift in the addiction world, I think.
I just want to drill a little further on the loss aversion bit. Does that generalize out to not feeling the negative consequences of other things other than losing money or losing a bet or losing a game, and having that not affect their behavior as much as the next person? Does that also translate to losing a partner or having negative consequences in social interaction?
I think so. A lot of times what it looks like, it's just denial. So we'll call it denial. They just seem to be not aware of what they're doing and the impact they have on themselves, their family, their friends, or their work. So neurocognitively, we think there's something a little bit amiss in terms of understanding and making those connections between what's happening in the world and your emotions. But it's also driven by, imagine having profound preoccupation and chasing intensity where you want to get back to even. You want to erase the damage you created. The only way you can think about erasing that problem is through gambling. So it's kind of a myopia, if you will, of kind of where your life problems are. And so invariably, almost all the gamblers I see with addiction, they say gambling is the solution and is the only solution to whatever ails me, whether it's financial problems, social problems, relationship problems, mood problems. And they keep pounding the gambling as a way of trying to fix those things. And they do that consciously and unconsciously. So it's really interesting. Again, I think that's what happens with a lot of patients, and the families come in, they say, I don't understand why Kevin keeps doing this. He's a good guy, but why does he keep lying? Why does he keep hiding? Why does he keep vanishing? And then the spouse usually says, it's probably because he hates me. I'll say, no, it's because his brain is working in just this one tiny lane, and it can't shift over into the other lane, and it's stuck in this one lane. And it's not his own fault. Now, it's his own fault if he doesn't want to do the work to shift lanes, but that's what happens with addiction. You get into a narrow lane, and it's very difficult to shift out on your own.
Yeah, it sounds like, a lot of similarities with some other addictions, but how is gambling addiction particularly unique when you compare it to other addictions?
So the story goes all the way back to, if you think about some of the original writings of gambling disorder, they come from like Dostoevsky, who wrote a book called The Gambler. And inside it, he just describes a very successful man at a roulette table who just literally just could not stop. And he gave away a very successful career and ultimately died. Freud even used to call it gambling disorder was kind of a form of self-masochism, because you just wanted to experience pain, and that's why you kept going on and on and on. Back in the DSM-4, back when I was in medical school, 1994, gambling was called pathological gambling. And there was enough scientific articles at that time to say, you know what, let's put it into the handbook, but let's not put it into the section on addiction. It was in the section on impulse control disorders, which included trichotillomania, pyromania, kleptomania, and intermittent explosive disorder. So in 1994, whatever it was, 30 years ago, believe it or not, APA says, you know what, we know that there's certain men and women that do this behavior where they gamble despite harmful consequences, but we don't know why. We don't have any understanding of exactly what's happening in their brain. So we're not yet ready to call it a substance use disorder because there's no drugs. Fast forward from 1994 to 2013, 20 years of neuroscience, imaging, various other EEG studies, genetic studies. There was also a bunch of LPs and CSF studies, all showing this kind of dopamine involvement, and enough to move pathological gambling from impulse control into the chapter of addiction. So in 2013, when DSM-5 came out, gambling disorder was renamed from pathological gambling to gambling disorder, and it sits in the chapter of substance-related and addictive disorder. So they declared it as of 2013. This is an addiction, a behavioral addiction. It's just not with substances.
So go there for a second. Behavioral addiction versus a substance use disorder.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're making the argument that science had built up the storyline that there's a physiological response that occurs involving dopamine and other neurochemicals that itself is the substance that these people have become addicted, and it's related to this behavior as opposed to when you ingest a substance itself that produces that neurochemical.
Right. And that's where even I get loose in my language all the time, but you're absolutely right. The precision is all addictive disorders are essentially behavioral addictions. The behavior is taking a drink of alcohol, injecting heroin, snorting cocaine, throwing dice. That's the behavior.
Yep.
The impact of the behavior is going to be very different. So if I take cocaine, I'm going to have a much more profound impact on my brain than if I'm, clicking a video game.
Yeah.
However, we've now come to realize that gambling, video game, pornography, those stimuli that are coming into your brain will activate the brain regions that are exactly activated in other forms of addiction. And one of the earlier studies, like back right around the turn of the century, was got Hans Breiter. Do you know Hans?
No.
So he really was one of the first to show that, hey, when you're showing images of money to people, that it expresses the same degree of activation in nucleus accumbens as cocaine or amphetamines. So I always go back, again, to Betty Ford, 1995. I was sitting with a guy who was there for a gambling disorder and cocaine disorder. He said to me, And I always remember his voice. He was very casual. He said, "It's too hot." It was July '95. He said, "It's too hot. I'm going to come back here in December." I said, "Why would you come back? I thought the whole point of rehab is to get better." He's like, "Well, it's nice here." But he told me, and I always remember, he said, "Tim, the one time I could control my cocaine addiction was when I was gambling. So I could sit at a blackjack table for 8 hours and never reach for cocaine."
Wow.
I said, "Wow." I said, "What do you mean?" I said to him, "Do you think they're the same?" He's like, "Oh, it's exactly the same feeling of escape, of high, of warped pleasure." He's like, "The come downs also the same. Once I stopped gambling after an 8-hour stretch, I just wanted to sleep for like 12 hours." And I said, "Did you ever use cocaine and gamble at the same time?" He's like, "No, it would never mix the two." So that was the first time. It always stuck with me how the power of just, quote, behavior is just as reinforcing as a substance that we would take in that could also alter ourselves. So
what about the inverse of that? Because I see alcohol use is prevalent with gambling, and even other drugs like cocaine. Like a lot of people probably use cocaine when they gamble, unless I'm incorrect. Is there a thread there regarding substance use?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, if
you
you take 100 men with gambling disorder to come into the clinic, we know that their rates of alcohol use, tobacco use, cocaine, cannabis use disorder are higher than general population. So these things go hand in hand.
Yeah.
The casino industry has known this since the dawn of the casino industry.
Right.
That's why they offer free drinks and free cigarettes. And if they could, they'd offer free cannabis and cocaine as well. But it's all this story of, again, altering your brain while you're there for some reason, whether you're there for entertainment, whether you're there for escape, whether you're there to try and make money. It's all part of the menu to try and get maximum activity, out of it.
Yeah.
But I feel like a lot of stories of my patients will be like, well, one thing leads to the other, and they end up using both at the same time. So I'm really depressed, and I turned to gambling to feel better. And then while gambling, I started drinking more because the drinks came fast and easy. And now I'm dealing with both.
Yeah.
Or I have folks who said, no, they started cocaine and methamphetamine while they were playing poker, and then they kept using cocaine and methamphetamine and eventually developed tolerance and physical dependence within a matter of a couple of weeks, and now they're dealing with both. So that's why it goes back to that addictive personality,
right.
But it really is someone who's likely to respond to very highly engaging and rewarding activities, in a very, very sharp way. So they'll respond to alcohol, tobacco, gambling, lottery, whatever, all at the same time.
Yeah.
Just to go back to the nucleus accumbens for a minute, thinking about this reward region in the brain, it doesn't only activate when you receive directly some type of reward or taking a rewarding substance, but also when you yourself do something positive socially. So if you donate real money to a charity in the scanner while you're getting a functional brain scan, the nucleus accumbens can light up.
Right.
And so it's striking that those two activities, one, giving money away, and two, trying to get money, are the opposite. But both activate this rewarding circuit. Is there any way that you've seen patients or even in the scientific literature where you can transfer the behaviors that are problematic and potentially harmful into something that's rewarding but not harmful?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And that's like kind of our basic principles of recovery, right? Where we say, you know what, in order to heal your brain, we need to continue to get your brain working everywhere. And maybe you have a nucleus accumbens that's a little bit more, say, sensitive than someone else, or a little bit less sensitive than someone else, but it's different. And we need to find other activities, not to replace the gambling, but that are better than gambling, that keep you engaged, that are healthy, that are positive. So when I look around the world, what do I see in LA that lots of people are doing to chase action and competition and thrill in LA? It's pickleball. Right? I mean, do either of you play pickleball?
It's the fastest growing sport in the United States.
A lot of injuries, a lot of folks. In fact, I have a medical student doing a research project looking at why certain people got into pickleball as a form of exercise, but they wouldn't get into anything else. So these are sorts of things I say to my men and women in recovery. I say, well, let's walk through a menu of other human activities that you haven't done or used to do or might do that might also activate your brain, your reward circuits in a way that is healthy and positive, and it's not going to lead to problems.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen, though, again, and this is what happens with some men and women with addictive disorder, they switch from gambling to work, or gambling to excessive exercise, or gambling to excessive recovery work, where they're going to 10 meetings a day and it's just too much. So it's always striking that balance between physical activity, physical rest with sleep, good nutrition kind of works. I think one of the things that's so fascinating, and you hit on that point, that the reward from gambling isn't always just the money that they receive or the money that they handle. It's the anticipation of being involved with money. So a lot of these folks talk about it's the drive out to the casino is the most exciting and rewarding. And there was a Simpsons episode. You guys are too young to remember this, but probably season 2 or 3. And Marge was about to have a potential affair with this French guy. Do you remember this episode?
I don't.
And he starts putting on his cologne, and he basically says this line, the only thing greater than the actual moment of getting a woman is the anticipation of the moment. So I always remember that, and you can see it, the dopamine flowing in his body. And I think that's when I say to folks, it doesn't always have to be the activity you're doing. Sometimes it's just thinking about the activity that can be a really good thing for you.
Right. So how does that then translate to other forms of addiction? Do you see that with, I don't know, someone that's addicted to fentanyl going out on the street trying to get their next fix? Is that rewarding in any sort of way?
Oh, absolutely. And, the story with a lot of other substances is misinterpreted. Oh, he or she's just scared and worried about withdrawal, then they're chasing. But there are a lot of folks out there that aren't in withdrawal, and they think about the escape, the process to get it, the buying it, the preparing the materials to use. All of that in of itself is for some and can be very, very highly rewarding than the actual use of the substance. So it took me years to understand that. I said, well, no, because if you use cocaine, it's in and out of your body within minutes, right? And maybe the effects last 30 to an hour, maybe 2 hours if you're lucky. But then people describe sometimes it's the drive from West LA to downtown that they were actually looking forward to. So it's all wrapped up, again, and I think it's important for us when in treatment to identify those things and say, because what happens a lot of times, patients say, I hate when I think like that, because they feel like I'm not working hard enough for recovery. Because these are like unconscious, automatic thoughts that just kind of pop up, or they feel really ashamed that they're still thinking and attracted to doing an activity they know is so bad for themselves.
What does that tell you about motivation then, and what motivates human beings if it's not the end result, the end reward, whether that's cocaine or the money from gambling, but rather going after it?
Well, I think of it this way. It's like, it's like a daydream, and most of what motivates us are our own thoughts about the future and what could happen, right? And so it's all abstract stuff.
It's tied into uncertainty, like
exactly.
We said before, right?
And I think if you don't have that, if you don't have the daydream, or you don't have hope, or you don't have the ability to think about what your future could look like, then what do you have? You're just living in the moment. And that doesn't sound totally human to me at all.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
A couple of things you said made me think about how gambling and maybe addiction in general has and continues to be hidden from the public eye and from the physician's eye and the family's eye in many ways. You said people disappear or that there's shame involved. So is this some kind of like invisible epidemic? What's the history on how this has been brought to light and the stigma around it?
Yeah, I mean, for years we'd call it the hidden addiction, right? You can't smell it, you can't taste it, you can't urine test it, you can't spot it. In your mind's eye, if you close your mind's eye and say, what does someone with a gambling disorder look like? A lot of people, even today, will still get a stereotype of an older white male, a little bit overweight, who drinks and smokes and talks fast and talks loud. You think about how cinematic depictions of gambling disorder are. Uncut Gems, Adam Sandler, the Gambler, James Caan, Mark Wahlberg, Onin Mahoney, Philip Seymour Hoffman. Right? That's kind of the stereotype. That's not true. We know that it affects people from all walks of life, all ages, all ethnicities, and things like that. So for years, again, I think until 2014, when it was actually put in the chapter of addiction, people would always say, well, I'm not quite sure what I have. And since there are very few treatment programs and very few places you can go, well, I just not going to like tell anybody about it. And the irony of gambling disorder is it's when you're in the throes of it, the last thing you want to admit is that you have a gambling addiction. Because again, gambling is still the solution to everything. Meaning that by definition, you keep pressing on, meaning if I just keep going, eventually I'll get back to even. That's the symptom by definition. You continue to think it's going to help out when it won't. So it's just a vicious cycle. So what happens is that by the time people call like our clinic here at UCLA, things are really bad. Things are metastatic. Things are really severe. There's pressure for them to get help, or they've reached the point where there's nothing left and they're desperate. The folks that are in the early stages of gambling disorder, like the first year or first 2 years, they're still working, they're still going to school, they still have money in their bank accounts. It's starting to impact their lives a little bit. And it's like, really, it's like that painless tumor, right? It's there, they don't know it's there, it's slowly impairing themselves, but they can't feel it directly. Zoom even farther out. Public health impacted gambling disorder. We know this is about a 1% to 2% prevalence rate in the general population, so it's not rare. We know that in California back in 2006, we found that number to be close to 4%. We know it's highly correlated with suicide, substance use disorder, other mental health problems, bankruptcy, other social ills like intimate partner violence, crime, et cetera, et cetera. But I've never heard of a case of a coroner's death certificate stating gambling disorder. You can't, quote, overdose and die. But you can gamble heavy, lose a lot, and drive your car off a cliff or shoot yourself in the head. And I think that's where, if you were to do a psychological autopsy, you'd say, no, it was untreated gambling disorder. But finding all that information out is hard. Why? It's really easy in 2025 to hide money.
Cover your tracks.
It's really easy to hide what you're doing. And even more now with our phones and our fintech apps, financial tech apps, you know, I can move money around in a heartbeat. And I could take loans out in an instant and never have to go to the bank, never have to pull out any cash. I think that's one of the most fascinating things the last few years of what I've been working with. Gamblers don't have any cash. And they're like, I don't go to a bank. I just take it out all on my phone. And really interesting stuff.
So what the digital aspect of things, obviously that's impacted gambling addiction from a public health standpoint. What have you noticed?
So people have said, well, with the onset of the phone, have we seen prevalence rates of gambling disorder go up? And the answer is that yes, in certain communities. So for instance, like certain states, when they do their state prevalence surveys, they found as high as 6%. The state I'm from originally, Illinois, when I grew up in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, there were no casinos. There was nothing. Then in medical school, they started to have casinos across, you know, in Iowa and Indiana. Now in 2025, we have, I think, a dozen brick and mortar casinos, including building one in downtown Chicago, like in the city. Statewide mobile sports betting parlors and strip malls, and of course the lottery. So you have more gambling access in the state of Illinois than ever before, and that's translated, unfortunately, to a 6% gambling disorder rate in the state, much higher than, say, California. So there's no doubt that the very facts for this is that when you have gambling access on your phone 24/7, the casino is now in your home. It used to be you had to go to the casino, now you don't. You combine the casino on your phone with, again, the financial ability to bet on your phone. That's why you have the syringe and the drug at the same time 24/7. And so it's an alarmist perspective, right? But it's the truth. And so we do know that that's driving up a couple of things. Earlier onset for people to gamble. It's much easier to gamble and extend gambling activity. It's easy to get credit. On the flip side, though, we have a lot more attention. So there are more states that have prevention, education, and early trainings that keep, I think, that prevalence rate down. But again, compared to 20 years ago, the sheer amount of gambling that's available, combined with the normalization of it, makes it much, much more likely that people are going to start engaging it on a regular basis.
Have you seen a shift in the age demographic becoming younger and younger? Or?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, obviously with sports betting since 2018, we see a lot of 18 to 30-year-old men who are getting into this and getting into it hard. When you look at gambling helplines across America, predominantly people are seeing that more and more young men are calling the helplines, running into trouble. But when you look at who's coming into actual treatment, it's still predominantly middle-aged, Caucasian men and women, slot machine, poker. We're seeing a lot more what we call social casino games, which are on the phone. So they're like slot machine simulators that are, where you can't win money, but you just play for digital money. Yeah. And people are spending real money to get into it. So really, essentially though, depending on where you look, you're just seeing a rise across the board. But I think people are most worried about that 18 to 24-year-old person because they're at the beginning of their lives. Yep. And if you have a significant disorder, medical, neurological, psychological, psychiatric, it just sets you back, right? And a lot of these guys I see, they come in, they're almost done with college, their life skills have been thwarted, they're financially behind, they're behind their peers. And in a world where, with AI and all that, I've been thinking about this a lot, like if you just get a few months behind, or you miss out on that one opportunity that gets you in the door, that might be it. Next thing you know, you're in your parents' bathroom, or your parents' basement for 10 years.
Bathroom, putting in bets.
That's right.
Sitting on the toilet putting in bets. I heard about that. Can we take a tangent on the lottery? I just wanted you to comment on the lottery because most people think gambling, casinos, sports betting online. But the lottery that is predominantly in neighborhoods of lower socioeconomic demographics, maybe some people don't associate that with some sort of gambling addiction. And you mentioned it. So
no, it's gambling. And, we have the kinds of regulated forms of gambling we have in California. We have the lottery, we have tribal casinos, we have card rooms, we have horse tracks, and we have sports betting through quasi-regulated, fantasy sports and things like that. But the lottery in California is massive. It's over, last I checked, like $9 billion a year. Somebody's buying that stuff. Wow. I've been part of a few media pieces where they ask me things like, why the biggest density of lottery vendors in Fountain Valley and Westminster, California? I don't know. I'm not a lottery expert, but part of it's the demand. Part of it is people look at various communities that embrace the lottery and are willing to do that. But in our state gambling treatment program, the lottery is the number 4 form of gambling that people come in reporting problematic behavior with it. So they're spending more than they want to. They're developing harmful relationship with the lottery. I'll give you an example. I had a guy that I've been seeing for a while who's struggles with scratchers, and that's kind of the most common one. And he'll spend $300-400 a week on scratchers, and he has a very limited income, creating debt, lost time, arguments with his wife, secrecy about the scratcher, and it's just all consuming thoughts that are not fun, that just plague his mind, that prevent him from really enjoying his life.
I want to hit on David Courtwright's The Age of Addiction, where he talks about limbic capitalism, suggesting that these businesses, more and more as technology advances, leverage the brain systems we started to talk about before that are involved in emotion, motivation, memory, survival, and are those same regions vulnerable to addiction. He talks about the 5 A's: accessibility, affordability, advertising, anonymity, and anomie, which is there's no kind of ethical, moral guideline or code, in a broader picture for how these things are supposed to be run and controlled. What do you think?
Well, those it's spot on. And when I've talked to a lot of gambling operators, I said, "Well, what are you trying to build here? Like, what's the point? When is it enough? And who you buying it from? I think I certainly subscribe to like the law of the few, right? Where we know that for whatever reason, whenever there's any business, there's only going to be a few percentage of people that are responsible for the biggest amount of revenue, whether it's tobacco, alcohol, Lululemon, Legos, right? There's always that core group that isn't the majority that end up spending the most money on that activity. We think that's true for gambling. In fact, we know it's true definitely for brick and mortar, and probably true for the online space. But there's still tons of other people who are still doing it for a while. So take any of these major gambling sports operators. They have millions of accounts. Millions, right? But what percentage of their open accounts are playing regularly, like every few days? Not that many. So when you drill back down, again, it's those things and bells and whistles they put on the apps that draw those folks in, sure, but it's also the folks themselves and what they're made of that not only become susceptible to those bells and whistles, but to the greater activity in of itself. So I think when you think about gambling, it's supposed to be a regulated activity, right? Like tobacco, alcohol, and cannabis, guns, and all that other stuff. And for the most part, it is, but there's still so much more unregulated gambling activity is out there in sports, in the digital world, and that's where it kind of creates some problems because we don't know anything about these operators, where they are, what they're doing. They can do it without the law, the letter of the law. So I think what he's getting to, and Cartwright is getting to, is exactly those things that create products that will take advantage of the human brain and the mindset, and will extract the most engagement from that. Now, whether you believe that to be ethical, that's another point of contention, because that's that whole capitalism part.
Well, I've seen 3% of online bettors make up 50% of the revenue of some of these sports betting companies. That seems pretty predatory and potentially exploitive.
It can be. I mean, but again, that number is in contention by lots of other folks. I've seen a wider range. I've seen that number like 10% up to 70. No, we don't really know. And again, I think like flip side, I say, what does that predatory mean? So I think borrowed from the world of tobacco, right? That was predatory, where they knew they had an addictive product. They buried the results, and they directly promoted very aggressively to populations that were very vulnerable, and they did so with impunity for years. The gambling industry is a little bit different. They've always known their product is potentially harmful for some. They've always known that it's bad for business to have people who are killing themselves, who are suing them, who are angry, right? But it's also bad for business to admit, oh my gosh, our product really is potentially addictive. So we've seen a shift in a couple of things. Brick and mortar casinos really don't make their money off gambling anymore. They make it off shows and dining, nightclubs, $1,000 cabanas, parking. So all their revenue, the gambling revenue, has shrunken down to like 20, 30% of their bottom line, which is fascinating because in the 70 to 80, it was like 95%. But the online betting companies, they don't sell other stuff. They only sell gambling. So that is a fascinating question when we say, okay, to the online folks, well, how do you sleep at night knowing that a good chunk of your customer base is really hurting? And every time I've asked that question privately, they always say, well, we know that for the most part, our product is creating a lot of joy for people. But for those folks that are really struggling, of course we want to help them. And of course we don't want their business. Now, of course, that's face value, and they're going to say that even in a private setting. But it is tricky. And how do you find out which ones are the ones that are really hurting? How do you shut them down? So I'll give you a quick story. Back in Chicago when I was growing up, they put riverboats in Iowa, right? And people were excited about this thing. And then the Iowa legislation said, we're worried about people developing a gambling problem, so we're going to put a limit on it. We're going to say no one can lose more than $500 in one given night, no matter how much money you make. What do you think happened? The Iowans said, no, this is un-American. It's my right to lose as much money as I want. How dare you tell me what to do? So we're pushing against a lot of other forces here. Very easily, Congress or a state could say to any gambling operator, the maximum amount an individual can spend on your product in one day is going to be X. And we would never have a gambling disorder.
Right.
But I can't think of any other industry where the maximum amount that you can buy in one day is X. Short of like a sale, like at a grocery store, where you can say you can only buy 8 steaks maximum, right? You can't do more than that. Right. So we're running into all sorts of things that aren't just because the gambling operators do it this way. It's just what our society has built and tolerates and what we value. Independence, freedom, self-reliance, freedom of choice, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I would say, what about over-serving at bars, right? The bar could potentially be implicated. And you went back to, well, how are these gambling sites supposed to do this? I've seen that gambling sites are able to figure out who's winning and limit their activity on the site.
Right.
So certainly they have the capability of doing that.
And that's where it's totally different because everything's tracked, right?
Right.
There's data on everything you do. Again, we're talking mainly regulated gambling sites.
Sure.
So they have tons of data, and that data can be used in all sorts of different ways. So there's no doubt. I've heard stories and seen my patients of mine where they would carve their data and present them bets and wagers that they know they like. Now, I bet on sports. I'm open about that. I'm a Chicago sports fan. There's certain bets I like on Chicago sports that I'm going to be more likely to bet than not. So you show me a Miami Heat or a Miami Dolphins bet, I'm not that interested. But you show me a Bears bet, I'm going to take a little bit longer look at that. So you're right. So there's absolutely that's an area. And now what I have heard them say to me is, so we do have some red flags that we see. When we see these patterns online, we're noting them. But then the next question is, and they ask it all the time, what are we supposed to do about that? Do we just shut them down without actually interviewing? Do we actually make them go through a screening to prove that they're worthy, like a means test, that they can continue to participate in this free form of entertainment? We don't know. So
a capacity assessment,
right? And again, what's different with the bartender has training, the bartender has a liability, and the bartender has some common sense because there's a physical assessment. Say, you've had enough, I'm no longer serving you. Again, in a digital world where you can't assess any of that, it's very difficult. You're just going on a number. So some of the things they've told me, like, well, if someone's base pattern of gambling is like once a week, $20, and it suddenly shoots up to daily to $300 every single day, that's a red flag, right? Or if someone keeps pouring in deposits, quickly and massively, without fail. If their betting patterns change, again, if maybe they used to only bet on wins and losses of the team, and now they're doing a lot of same game parlays. There are things that can be tracked. And now, in their defense, they haven't opened up their books, but they've opened up to say, hey, what can we do? How do we stop this? So almost all the regulated mobile sports betting apps now have different responsible gambling notifications or settings on the app you can put. Maximum limits, maximum withdrawals, maximum number of bets per week. I want to talk to a responsible gambling ambassador. It's all kind of baked in, but it's all fuzzy, right? It's kind of like going to a bar and having a bartender tell you how to drink in a safe way. So I think some people feel like, well, that's a little disingenuous. But at the same time, and this is a big point of mine, I think of gambling as a form of entertainment. And if you use the word spend, then I think people understand it a little better. In other words, I spent $3,000 last year on Kings tickets. I probably did, right? 10 games, whatever. That's a lot of money. Versus I lost $3,000 betting on the Kings. Those are the same amount of money, but emotionally they have two very different outcomes. And so what I encourage a lot of people when they're starting into gambling is to say, don't think about winning or losing on gambling. Think about spending. How much are you willing to spend to get dopamine? How much are you willing to spend to get a little bit of an escape, right? And I thought about that, thinking a lot again, how much these tickets are. We went to the Dodgers game the other day, and it was like almost $600. So if you argued, well, we spent 7 hours watching the Dodgers at $600, or I could have gone for 7 hours at a card table spending $600 on poker. Again, different emotional experiences. At the end of the day, I'm still out $600.
Yeah.
So the other thing about sports betting and particularly on the phone is that the advertisement game has changed. So the enticements are quite different, right? You talked a lot about how much you could lose and the different behaviors that they might be, or vulnerabilities that might be exploiting or tracking and trying to figure out if there's a problem. But what about the enticements? Is that ethical?
That's a whole thing of itself, and it's a whole fascinating world. Number one, regulated casino advertising is supposed to be regulated, which means we regulate tobacco, alcohol, cannabis advertising tightly, right? We regulate gun advertising really tightly, right? We don't regulate casino or sports betting advertising. Why? And what I mean by regulate, like what's the messaging? what audience. This is not meant for kids, and yet any kid can see these things. There you go. And again, using combination of celebrities, social media influences, the positive influences, and creation of a world of a product that isn't necessarily attached to it. So in other words, when you advertise the world of gambling as fame, power, spectacular success, women, young people, beautiful people, action, that's all exciting. It's not really what gambling is selling, right? What is it really selling? It's selling, entertainment, but it's not selling a lifestyle. So I feel like that's a big misnomer because that's not what it's selling here. So, but it creates that kind of attraction, which what does that do? It normalizes gambling for everyone, and it reduces the perception of harm. Reduces the perception of harm. And when you reduce perception of harm in the world, you get people more likely to engage in it, more likely to do it ongoing, thinking, oh, it's not that big of a deal. How much could be harmful? You look at this ad, it's really fascinating, right? Number one, the enticement, risk-free first bet up to $1,000.
Risk-free?
Risk-free. It's risk-free. To whom? Well, imagine a bar. Alcohol-free first drink? No. Hangover-free first drink? It would never be last one. So it's definitely an enticement that we think is disingenuous. It's a term that's made up. And again, look at the volume of which we're offering. Can you think of any other business in America that gives you $1,000 worth of merch? Right?
Just to get involved.
Just to get involved, right? Oh, well, come to UCLA surgery, get $1,000 off your next laparoscopy, right? Or get $1,000 free MRI. No, maybe we ought to, but we don't. But the point is that isn't regulated. There are laws that should be in place to say there should be a cap on how much. Is that taxable income? It's weird because the gambling operators say it's not, but the feds say, no, that's money and you should be taxing people.
Wow.
Real. And so it's all, but they're like, no, this is just virtual. This is all these terms. This is fake, blah, blah, blah. No, it's not. It's $1,000 right there. The other part, paid in free bets. And then you see all the responsible gambling. You barely even see that, even like in 1080, it's hard to see. So you put it all together, yes. I think the advertising is disingenuous at best. It's promoting a lifestyle that isn't attached to gambling. It's just not. Now, I would argue, what are we selling here? We're selling, hey, we have a new product. We have a new form of entertainment in America. That's fine. But put it that way. Now we're almost generating a culture where this is like a product that you can buy and purchase and hold. That's stock. That's an investment. That's not what this is. This is just, again, a little bit different. And again, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when you ask these celebrities, would you ever want to do this? They would have said, absolutely not. I don't want to be associated with the gambling world at all because those are sinners. That's a vice. And imagine how fast we've changed now where celebrities are running to partner up because they're seen as legitimate companies. And they are, again, legitimate companies. There are just some practices, I think, that could be better and healthier.
I mean, to even think about the educational piece, I mean, everybody knows that this is probably not the best use of time and that you may be vulnerable. But to think back to the beginning of our conversation, that the reward seeking and repeated kind of perseverance in this type of behavioral pattern actually can change the brain itself.
Right.
I think that's a game changer, where it started as fun and a pastime, a hobby, a once a week thing, or every, Monday night, it has become something that I can't live without.
That's right. Yeah. And I have a friend his name's Rob Minnick, and he's a social media influencer. He's One Day at a Time, and he didn't even know it was a sitcom from the 70s. He's a Gen X guy. But he's a perfect storm. He's like 26, 27, loves sports, started playing sports, started betting on sports legally when he came of age, started doing it casually, and then he described it so well. He'd watch the games, he'd bet on the games, he had a good time with his friends, they'd watch it together. But when his friends went home, they stopped gambling. They watched a movie, they went to bed. When he went home, he continued to gamble on sports that were still on. Table tennis in Hungary, other things like that. his brain is different. And why his brain went down that route and his other friends didn't is the fascinating part of addiction and mental health.
Yeah.
Because he was and again, I'm oversharing the story, but the way he said it so well. My friends could go home and go to bed. I went home, I continued to gamble more. The itch, the compulsion, the urge. And then with gambling, it's just a matter of time before financial losses or expenditures start to rise. It's just math. This is so important where people who bet on sports will say, I don't gamble, I bet on sports. Because they're saying, sports betting inherently has a little more skill, more knowledge. It's not based on randomness like a slot machine.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating, and I hear that. But the types of wagers that are being offered on sports betting apps now are much, much more random. So, like, for instance, did you know that the vast majority of bets that are on these apps now in states that have legalized sports betting are the same game parlay, right? So that's for the audience that doesn't know, I'm putting a low stakes wager, let's say $10, on 5 things to happen in the sports world, either that night or over the course of a couple of weeks or a month. And my $5 could, if all 5 things happen, will pay out at a much higher rate. $5 to win 100, $5 to win $1,000, $2,000. So we're in June 2025, and right now, here's an example of what is happening in the sports betting world that drives and fuels this excitement without education. There was a young bettor, a young man, who put a $13 5-headed parlay on the various winners of the various major sports. It came down to the Thunder and the Oilers won championships this month. He would have turned his $13 into $270,000.
Oh my God.
Right. So right now we're like, that's an interesting story. That's fascinating.
Right.
So imagine what's happening inside his brain. And imagine what's happening inside the brains of thousands or if not millions of young men and women who see his story thrown out there on Twitter. Right.
It's possible.
Yeah. It happened to him, it happened to me. Whoa, what did he need? Cash out. Oh my God, that's so cool. What's he going to do with the 270? Is he going to make his own podcast now? He's not paid by the casinos at all. He's the best advertising form they could possibly think of, right?
Oh.
So I bring that up because it's become almost like a national discourse of what this guy should do. And Americans, we celebrate spectacular success. We also celebrate and talk about spectacular failures. So I pile that all in together, kind of, again, essentially, why this is, very much a cautionary tale.
Yeah, I think, we know at the casinos, they use the lights, they use the sounds because, that entices them further, especially with the phone. We know phones, separate from the whole sports betting thing, in and of itself is a very addictive device.
Right.
And then now you have this laid on top of that. Can you speak to that a little bit, layering this addiction on top of potentially another one?
Yeah, and again, we use the language in our world, device management.
Sure.
Digital world. And again, as every year that passes, it becomes more and more sophisticated. Every year with AI, even all of these tools, whether it's financially or gambling operators, it becomes so fast, it's hard to process even what's out there. So it's a different world, and it's going to require a different set of tools to kind of manage that. A few years ago, I used to say, get rid of your phone, go Amish, go to a flip phone. But that's not possible. You can't live in a world without a smartphone. You can't go anywhere or do anything, and that's part of it. We do have software blockers for men and women with gambling disorder where on their phone they can't go onto these gambling sites. And that helps to shade, but they still struggle with their own banking needs on their phone. So essentially, we're just layering, as you say, and I like that analogy, again, the syringe is getting wider and the stuff in the syringe is getting more thick and more viscous and more content, and it's been delivering faster into our bodies, super, faster and faster. So the end result there, I think this is something a lot of healthcare providers have never heard about, this idea of healthy device management. For physicians, the nurse practitioners, to take some time and whatever setting you're in and just talk to your patient about what are healthy device management. So by that I mean, and you're a neurologist, scrolling all night right before bed, an hour and a half, isn't an example of healthy device management, right? Science tells us that. Same thing, being well aware of what apps are on your phones, that could give you notifications of things that might activate your reward system. Scrubbing your phone so you don't have these automatic notifications, or making sure these apps don't show up. That's device management. Putting limits on, again, time limits on things that you have, so you don't go into that world of just constantly being stuck, wrapped up into it. So it's a new area, but I think it's an important area for us in healthcare to recognize, because we do have a duty to bring that up, because the phone impacts body, brain, mind, health in many, many ways.
Yeah. Quickly, can we discuss the parallel between elite athletes and their involvement in gambling? Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods. Right. Certainly there's others out there that maybe I'm not thinking about, but
yeah. So
what do you think?
A few years ago, we started doing more mental health work with athletes at UCLA. We have a sports psychiatry service, and I got into that mainly because of cannabis, because there were a lot of questions about cannabis and is it performance enhancing? What about drug testing, addiction, blah, blah, blah. The massive expansion of sports betting has changed all that in terms of its impact on athletes, really in three ways. Number one, gambling disorder among athletes has always been a concern. I mean, they're vulnerable, but they're particularly more vulnerable, I think, than the general population because of two things. One, high levels of competitiveness combined with high levels of knowledge. So when you have those two things and you think that's going to give me an edge in sports betting. And some of these high-profile athletes, sure, have had very high-profile cases of major heavy betting and potentially sports, gambling disorder. There are many athletes do not. So, like, for instance, when you look at NCAA surveys of gambling disorder among NCAA athletes, their actual prevalence rate of gambling disorder among male athletes is a little bit higher than the general population, but for female athletes, it's tiny. It's barely registered. So that's one thing. Number two, gambling in athletes really matters in the modern age because of integrity on sports. So we love sports, right? Yep. But we would love sports even less if we knew the outcomes were predicted or were set, right? I love professional wrestling. I still watch a ton of wrestling. It's sports entertainment. The outcomes are predicted. You don't know how as a watcher, but it's fixed. We want to believe all our sports are not. And all those conspiracy theories through the years, right? It's rigged, it's fixed, it's on the take. It's all part of the allure of sports. But at the end of the day, why we want it is because we want to see contests that are based on merit, right? Not based on, a preset, right? So the real question is, with all the sports betting money flowing around, it's much easier for an athlete to alter the integrity of a game than ever before. And I'll give you an example, not just the outcome. As you know, you can bet on every single event. So now you have bets on speed of first pitch. But the Dodger game on the other day, and I opened up the gambling app to see, what are sorts of things that they're offering. First pitch, ball or strike. First pitch, 98 miles an hour above or below. That's the kind of sports integrity I'm talking about. One pitch isn't going to make a difference in the game.
That's true. That's good.
But if I approached that pitcher, I said, top of the third, first batter, I need you to throw it in the dirt. And then I bet 20 grand, I'm going to give you 10. We're basically affecting the integrity of the game, but no one's ever going to notice.
What about color of Gatorade? That's a bet, right?
That is a bet.
But that doesn't affect the outcome of the game.
No, but people would argue that's not really a bet on sport. It's just kind of a peripheral prediction market. Right. And the last lane of betting and gambling on athletes that's so critical, and John Oliver mentioned there as well, is just the digital and real world abuse that athletes are taking now, specifically because of gambling. And that concerns me the most, because I can't imagine being an athlete and every game, no matter what you did, good or bad, somebody lost money on you. And because of the digital world on the phone, they can reach you. Your DMs, your Twitter, Venmo requests. Can you imagine being a 19-year-old college basketball player getting Venmo requests for $10, $15 from just random strangers because you didn't hit their parlay? That's got to hurt you. But now there's a report just released just today or just this week from the Women's Tennis Association just talking about the the types of abuse the players would get, the vitriol, the death threats, the sexual assault threat, all related to gambling.
Wow.
Yeah.
And all related to this digital world where I don't have to show my face and make all these threats to you. Yeah. So I have a lot of apps on my phone that are interesting. One app I have is just the score, right? It just gives you the score of the games, right?
Yeah.
And there's a chat feature, right? And you go into that chat feature, it is a nonstop roll of just hate speech, racism, sexism, and 80% of it is driven about money. 80% of it is about gambling. So anyway, so those are the 3 lanes that we worry about for athletes for sure. Them developing addiction themselves, the integrity of the sport they play being altered because of gambling influences, and then again, the abuse they feel and experience at the hands of online bettors.
Yeah. You mentioned going Amish and just completely abstaining as part of your sort of treatment or approach for gambling addiction versus maybe harm reduction. Can you kind of delve into that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think our treatment principles are very clear, and it's since gambling disorder is a biological, psychological, social condition like all addictions, gambling treatment needs to be a biological, psychological, social treatment. So we have medications, we have various other treatments that can help. Sure, that's easy. Psychological treatments that work, counseling and therapies, social treatments like Gamblers Anonymous and other things that work. But oftentimes when patients come in, I'll say to them, what are our goals of care for you? And because gambling is so baked in and so pervasive, we need to identify which forms of gambling are most harmful and which aren't. Because it turns out that some men and women are able to still gamble, let's say, on sports, but they just can't gamble on slots. So it would not be efficient to say no gambling whatsoever when it actually turned out they could probably do it safely and still enjoy it. But every case is different. So that's why we work through it. And the harm reduction is a funny term because it's still steeped with a lot of mystery, and it feels like, oh, you're allowing them to still do this behavior. And no, it's not. What I'm trying to do is engage them in ongoing treatment and to minimize the damage that behavior is doing on their lives. That's really what harm reduction is. Or another way of saying it is just making their lives a little bit better. I'll give you an example of sports betting. I get a lot of sports bettors to say, I love watching sports. If I'm going to get control of my gambling disorder, can I still watch sports, or is that a no? And if I don't have that, I could potentially lose a big chunk of my social life. So that's an interesting question. And usually we walk through it. We go through, well, what happens if you watch sports? Will you be activated or triggered to want to bet? If you're watching with friends who are still betting and they egg you on and they don't know you have a gambling disorder, how are you going to handle that? If you're married and your spouse is concerned that just because you're watching a football game, he or she might think you're relapsed, how are you going to handle that? So it's all part of that. And I think I had a patient this week who said, what, I've made a decision. I'm not going to watch sports anymore, and I'm much happier now. And he said to me, I never thought I could live, without watching sports, but I found out there's this whole other world out there other than sports. So same thing. It means there are different ways of reducing harm, and it doesn't have to be 100% no gambling ever or no watching sports ever.
You guys talked about this on Table Talk, where you gambled for charity, and talked all about how he had kind of harnessed his interest in gambling, but then instead of doing it in a problematic way, uses it as a platform for his YouTube channel.
Right. Yeah.
So is that? I think patients must be thinking: is that allowed? Is there a hard and fast biological rule that you can do some as long as it's not too much, or that you must not do any of this problematic behavior?
It's an evolving principle. Gamblers Anonymous for years would say, no gambling of any kind is allowed. And if you did, you lost time and went back to day zero. A lot of patients did that, and they felt incredibly shamed and said, no, this is wrong, and why am I being punished for something when it's really innocuous? And unlike, say, heroin, where any return just one day will potentially lead to death, we know that, just making one bet isn't likely to destroy your life unless you bet, your entire life saving on one bet, which you could. So I think it's much more subtle. That's why we fold back and say the goal really is positive, healthy lifestyle, quality of life that you're proud of. And the markers of recovery that I look at are home, health, purpose, and community. Meaning if those domains of those 4 things are going well in your life, and if there's a little bit of gambling or if gambling helps improve that, then that's not addiction. You're now in the zone of a healthy frequency of that activity. And I think that's what's so difficult. Again, I think what we learned in the field of addiction, when you put things in black or white, all or none, you then just pigeonhole folks, and then you miss out on what's real and genuine. No one wants to be told, oh, just because you gambled once, you're no longer a good person. But if you set those rules for yourself and say, no, my rules of recovery are I'm never going to go back to the tables ever again in any shape or format. I won't do that. I think in this case, it's the first time I encountered something like this where he did, and he was saying this is his career. He's a media influencer, and he makes a good living. He's still got problems, as we all do, but comparatively to what he had before, those problems are much, much less. And his overall quality of life is a lot better. And I think that's ultimately what we try and do in treatment, is to say, what should we be focusing on to make your quality of life better?
So if we say you can, if gambling is allowed to a certain degree as long as other elements of your life are good, but that's not life though, right? Life gets hard, it gets difficult, and it's not always peachy.
Right.
How does someone keep from going back into that habit and addiction and making it a problem?
So a lot of the patients I work with, they're continuing in care. So I'll see them for maintenance, like once a month, once every few months, or we're monitoring these different things. A lot of folks, they just learn more monitoring recovery skills themselves. So they know, oh, this is a sign of trouble when I'm thinking about gambling too much to the point where I'm skipping work, or I'm secretly moving money around and not telling my wife what I'm doing with it, or I'm betting more and spending more on gambling than I intended. For instance, I had a guy who I'm working with right now who last year's gambling expenditures were about $300,000, and he makes close to $800,000. That's still half. Right. So he's been slowly over the last decade draining his financial, so he doesn't have a lot of savings for retirement. He doesn't have a lot of cash on hand. It's getting harder. But he said, I'm not willing to give up my gambling this year. So at the beginning of the year, he and I established what would be the amount of money you are willing to spend on this activity. He established $50,000. Now, that's a lot of money. So far, we're about halfway into the year. He's spent about $10,000. So financially, he's doing way differently. Quality of life is a little bit better, but it's an example where you can, for some patients, not all, create, in every single patient, you create an individual kind of recovery plan that works for him. Every time, though, I meet with him, I say, tell me again, what's the reason you still are willing to spend $50,000 on this activity per year? And then he's actually the one that said to me, with that analogy with sports tickets, well, how is it any different if I spent $25,000 on Lakers season tickets? Because that's what it would cost, right? And I that was such a light bulb moment even for me, and said, you're right. But it's spending, and the spending is damaging your future. So whether you spend on Laker tickets or in this case slot machines, we do need to come with a number to limit the harm that potentially is going to come in the next few years.
Where are we at with relapse versus recurrence and the different terminology to not stigmatize and create some shame?
Words matter, right? I'm a Gen X stock, right? So I didn't really grow up with a lot of these understandings. We just use words, right? But they do matter. And so now I've been using persons with gambling disorder instead of gambling addict. Relapse, again, why is it stigmatized? It's very kind of passive. It sounds like, you kind of went into it, you lost control, versus reactivation or recurrence. With diabetes, what do we say? We don't really say, we had a relapse of diabetes. We use relapse in cancer still, right? The cancer relapse. Or we'll say the cancer returned, right? And sometimes I'll say that. I'll say, it seems like to me your addiction is definitely more active this month than before, or it's reactivated. So it's a little bit more intense now than I'd like to see it. So I'm trying to borrow from the language we use in medicine, but we do that all the time, with cancer. And I think when I'm really doing the work well, I'll say to a patient, in the event the gambling resurfaces, what's the term we should use later on? And then some patients will say to me, well, call it a relapse, or just say, no, I'm never getting rid of this, quote, condition. So why would I ever think it's ever going to be gone? It's always going to be there. So there's just going to be periods where it's quiet and periods where it's active, just like sickle cell anemia. And a patient taught me that. I said, you know what, that makes a lot of sense. You never cured of sickle cell, but let's try and contain those clinically significant episodes to a minimum. And I think that's what really helps for some folks.
Yeah, piggybacking off of that, I always thought, the changes in the brain that we see with opioid addiction or with methamphetamine use, these changes are likely secondary to the drug being ingested. Right? But with gambling, that's kind of flipped it on its head, or allowed me to kind of think about it differently, where it's like, if we're seeing brain changes with gambling addiction, there's necessarily no substance that's being ingested, yet we're still seeing these changes.
So there's two thoughts that we were thinking about that over the years. Number one, is it just continuing gambling? Somehow you're naturally expressing excessive or altered amounts of dopamine and serotonin that Mother Nature never intended, and your body's reacting to that. Okay. Or B, more than likely, it's just the other stuff that's creating problems in your brain. Sleep deprivation, excessive amounts of cortisol, nutritional stuff where you're eating like Slim Jims and ramen all day, right? Not exercising. And maybe those things which profoundly impact biology ultimately are the reason why we're seeing differences. Or frankly, they're just born different from day one. From day one, just differences in receptor density or neurotransmitter production or, electrical wiring efficiency, whatever. But we actually wrote a paper early on in my career asking that question: is gambling neurotoxic? Is gambling neurotoxic? And to this day, it sounds great. I could argue both sides of it. But what I can say very clearly to patients, and as I simplify my thinking, is we know things that are really bad for you that you're not doing. And we've done papers now showing that a lot of our gamblers have really terrible sleep hygiene, and they don't sleep well. Well, that's going to impact your brain, right? Sure. They don't exercise, and when you don't exercise, that's going to impact your brain. And when you have really high processed food, and this is mainly our brick and mortar gamblers, right? Would eat just fast food all the time or skip meals. That's going to have a profound impact on brain functioning. So I think that's probably more of it, rather than just the idea of excessively gambling naturally creating states that are bad for or that create a scar for the brain. But it's possible.
Yeah.
So we've touched on it a lot in various ways with a lot of the cases you've described, but I think your approach, and maybe this is the wave of the future, is more holistic and maybe a brain health approach to addiction treatment through the biological, psychological, and social categories. But maybe just elaborate on that, talk to us about that, and thinking about, someone listening to this, how do they get to find someone that's thinking holistically as opposed to shaming them or just seeing a community or reading about it online, getting misinformation about how to deal with this?
Well, I think we've come a long way in the addiction field. We have addiction medicine, we have addiction psychiatrists, we have a lot of psychologists that get training in addiction, and we have a lot of folks now that are getting extra training in gambling disorder. So the field now in 2025 compared to when I first started in 2005, there's a lot more humans out there, thousands of people who are doing it. I think, again, addiction treatment is becoming much more, more than just obviously taking a pill and just going to 12-step. When people say, what are the biological treatments for gambling disorder? I'll say sleep, physical movement, healthy nutrition, social connection. These are biological treatments. Then what about the meds? What about the injections? What about the TMS and psilocybin? I mean, they're lingering, but it's nothing like those things.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to the biggest thing on treatment is just understanding the person that you're seeing never wanted this to happen. So I've never met a person with a gambling disorder or any other addictive disorder said, I'm glad I developed this addiction. I'm glad I got cancer. I'm glad I had a concussion. No, these are just medical, psychiatric, and neurologic conditions that happen to people. And so by not laughing at them or criticizing them or rolling our eyes at them, I think that's a big deal. I've had a lot of patients tell me that. They'll say, you don't judge me. I'm like, no, I'm with you. I'm like, have you been judged? And they'll talk about stories how, I mentioned how much money I spent on gambling to my last therapist, and she just was like, oh my God, you spent as much as I make in 1 year. That's not really a way of connecting with people. So I feel fortunate that we're really changing the narrative of training. We're doing a lot more gambling training in addiction conferences and trying even to get it to like the medical schools and various other folks there as well that are willing to hear this sort of thing. So definitely, again, if we were back in the 90s when I remember, I went to Northwestern, pretty good med school, very good med school. And I remember going on rounds and surgery and medicine and seeing patients with addiction and saying, I'm interested in this. I want to know more about it. And a constant barrage of really smart attendings and residents saying, well, why would you want to waste your time on those people? And even when I came here to UCLA, the same thing. The first couple of years, I sensed that a lot. Patients get admitted to CHS repeatedly, opioid. this guy's back again. He did it to himself. Really? We got to readmit this guy or this joker, right? That's stigma, right? And I think we've changed that narrative a lot. We still have a long way to go. But I think about all these young trainees, right, that we all work with, right? They come in with a very different perspective on addiction than I ever did. So,
well, I mean, you bring up a very important point, I think, about the spectrum of choice in addiction. The stigma and the way I think it used to be thought before we had more data on it was that this is a person's choice.
Right.
And they're making the wrong choice repeatedly. They have no willpower, no discipline, no grit. Or now maybe on the other end of the spectrum, they are completely moved by the enticements, the advertising, the accessibility. They're being manipulated. Right. It's not their fault.
Yeah.
Where are you in that spectrum?
Somewhere in the middle. We're not zombies. When people used to say, their brains are changed so much that they've lost the power of control or impairments in frontal lobe, decision making, they're not zombies. People still know right from wrong. People can still do the work. But I think what is different is when these enticements or the things on their phone pop up, the ability to resist is harder in the moment. If you're sleep deprived, if you're stressed out, if you're hungry, if you're tired, and you're vulnerable, your brain is going to be a much more vulnerable state. And then when you get exposed to these stimuli, then you're likely in an instant to yield to that activity. That's not willpower. That's not being a zombie. That's just your brain reacting to what's presented in front of you. I think that's what is different, So oftentimes when patients say this, I'll say, you know what? You have a choice to decide how much and how hard you want to work on recovery. You have complete freedom over that. No one's going to tell you what to do. But you live in a world where your recovery and your condition could be activated in an instant through no fault of your own or through other things, which is why, what's the acronym they always say? Hungry, angry, lonely, and tired, right? Have you heard of that?
No.
So that's a big one in recovery circles. If you're any of those four, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, that means your brain is in a vulnerable state, and you better remove yourself from situations where you might be presented with substances or other addictive behavior. And that's pretty good, right? So that's really the thing, is that if you have a vulnerable brain or a brain that's potentially at risk, you do have to work harder in life to make sure you're not exposed to these things or go down the hole. So I get a lot of folks who, when they had a reoccurrence or they do that, I say, how come you didn't call me? And I'm available 24/7. How come you didn't hit me up by phone or text when you were driving out to the casino? Didn't think I could. Well, you could. And then later on, I had one patient tell me, Dr. Fong, if I could call you when I was having urges and cravings, by definition, I wouldn't have this addiction. I would be able to handle it. And then we kind of laughed at it. But I realized she was right, is that despite all the work we do together in a therapy session, applying it in the real world when you're feeling really vulnerable is really tough. So,
well, what could you possibly say? I have close friends, family members who have addictions, and I haven't found the right thing to say. I don't know what one could say in the situation where they're on their way to the behavior, to the substance.
There's no right or wrong. I think when you say you should stop or stop doing that, you're an idiot. That's not helpful. We usually encourage family members to say things that are how it's impacting yourself. I see that you're headed out to the casino or to the bar. That concerns me. I worry about your future. I'd like to help out by this way. Would that be helpful? I'd like to take you to dinner now instead of you going out.
No.
Kind of like focus on yourself, right? And I think it's really, again, by sharing in a moment too when they are present. If they're engaged in that activity, they're not thinking, they're distractible, they have urges, they have cravings, they're already, quote, gone. But when they're feeling better after a good night's sleep or they're more present, you say, you know what? Last week when you were supposed to be at the party, or when you showed up intoxicated at the party, or when you were gone from the party, I was really hurt. I was worried about you. I'm concerned about your future. I don't know what's going on with you because of your life, but I know in my experience that that's not a great sign. That's it. Non-judgmental. It's just how you feel. It's hard. People don't talk that way.
No.
Right? People like to whisper behind closed doors and point fingers. And I think using those statements of how it affects you is the most powerful. And we get that a lot. A lot of times, family members say, well, I don't know what to say. I'm like, well, just say how you feel. And then we actually identify how they feel to get the words out.
Yeah. What about someone that thinks they might be in the middle of a gambling addiction? What is something that you would recommend, something that they can do on their own, first couple of steps, or even the first step maybe, to help themselves?
So the internet is incredibly useful for this because a lot of folks who are in the middle of a gambling problem, every now and then they'll get curious about, well, what's happening with me? What am I doing? I don't like this. What am I doing wrong? And now, instead of calling a 1-800-GAMBLER, they're just searching the internet. Signs of a gambling problem. What to do with gambling losses, right? Just how do I stop gambling? How do I get better at sports betting? Those are kind of the searches that they're going to do. So now they're going to find things like podcasts. So there's now 4 or 5 really good podcasts that are voices of recovery that are entitled "What to Do," sign that you have a gambling problem, or "What to Do if you think you have a gambling problem." There's also a couple apps I work with and that we're designing that are meant to give people education in a non-judgment. They're not treatment. They're just giving you information about gambling, like the numbers, the risks, what's going to happen, and describe the difference between addiction versus passion versus habit. So that's out there. And I think for a lot of folks who are just going through it again, they oftentimes don't realize that it's something that they can correct. That's the hard part. So usually what I say to folks in the beginning, instead of focusing on stopping the gambling or trying to get rid of it, add to the things in your life that are clearly missing. So if you're missing exercise, if you're missing social connection, if you're missing a sense of purpose, if you're missing 3 to 4 healthy meals a day, if you're missing 7 hours of sleep a night, let's focus on that stuff first. Those are things that you haven't done in a while. It might take a while to get, but maybe they're in better control than trying to stop the urge and the cravings around that activity.
Do you get buy-in from that, or are people thinking this is not related? You've completely missed me. I'm talking about gambling, and you're talking about
some. And it's some because they're like, I came here to stop my gambling. And I've said, well, the best way to stop your gambling is to start doing these other activities first. So I had one guy like that where he's been through a lot of other gambling counselors, a lot of other GA meetings, nothing really worked. And we identified that what he really wanted was competition. And so we talked about, he used to swim in high school, or he had stopped swimming. I said, and he thought, oh, there's no adult swim leagues anymore. Like, yeah, there are. You go to the Y, and there's all sorts of things. And he didn't know about that. So he started doing that, and within just 2 months, stopped gambling, swimming every day, joined a swim team.
Wow.
Also started coaching swimming for young kids. Happier than ever. And that was an example where prior to that, all the focus had been on identify your triggers, identify, the reasons why you gamble, go to GA meetings whenever you're not feeling great. None of that was working because, like we mentioned earlier in the cast, he was needing something.
Yeah.
He got that dopamine from reactivating his swimming.
So a holistic perspective, but what about things like naltrexone and other medications?
So right now, June 2025, we do not have any FDA-approved medication for gambling disorder. There are a few that, if they were actually, I think, to be applied for, probably would have gotten approval, but there's just no push from Big Pharma. So we do know that opioid antagonists, naltrexone and nalmefene, have been shown in clinical studies to reduce gambling urges and cravings, and therefore subsequently gambling behaviors. Okay. We also have other meds like N-acetylcysteine, this kind of, as you all know, these fancy, what do you call it, cognitive enhancer, maybe with improvement in some self-control and things like that. And we also know that medication-wise, treating the underlying co-occurring psychiatric condition that's not treated, ADHD, bipolar disorder, depression, trauma, will really reduce gambling if gambling is being used as kind of a way to treat those, to self-medicate those things there as well.
How commonly are you seeing that co-occurrence with?
Again, about, I'd say 60-70% of our cases, they have something untreated or unaddressed.
Got it.
We have that. We have a couple clinical trials now throughout the nation looking at TMS. Again, TMS, most people don't even know that TMS is approved for smoking cessation, right?
Yeah.
And you wouldn't know that. They don't advertise it. So we've had a few case reports like that. So there are some biological treatments that are on the cutting edge. But I've been involved in other trials. We tried antipsychotics. We tried topiramate. We tried lots of SSRIs. None of them really had a strong signal. Because what happened in medication trials for gambling disorder, you get a big placebo response rate, right? It would be like 40, 50%. So that you can't get separation with a medication. So meaning the power of human connection and literally just talking about your gambling behavior is enough to get people to modify it. And I think that's really powerful in of itself.
As long as you can bring people to the table and you have someone on the other side. I mean, I feel like every time we try to refer people to psychology or psychiatry, patients have trouble accepting that referral and or finding someone that they actually resonate with.
Right. Yeah.
What about from a public health standpoint, if someone gave you the reins right now with regulating sports betting online, what would you do?
So number one, I would make it a national federal response. I would eliminate this from a state by state, and I would just have a few gambling operators nationally. We don't need 20 different or 30 different gambling apps. We just need a couple. And then I would pour a significant amount of money into prevention programming so that people who are first starting to learn how to gamble can learn how to do so in a way that's responsible and understand it. I would also beef up our advertising work so that we would have much less glamorous and over-dramatized advertising. We'd have advertising focusing much more on this is where you can get the app and this is what's available on the app. I would limit the no-risk bets down to essentially very much zero. And I would get rid of the VIP programs, the ones who are massive gamblers and they get all the perks, the free sweaters and tickets to concerts and things like that. But I think, again, so in other words, it requires a national response. But it's incredibly difficult when it's a state-by-state issue.
Yeah.
And, when other countries have done that, whether it's like Canada, Australia, many parts of Europe, these are nationally run gambling operators. In other words, the government is the casino. The government authorizes who runs it. So they run it very tightly, so they know what goes in and what goes out. There isn't a lot of unregulated activity because the government operated one is a really good operator and does everything it's supposed to do.
Yeah. Let's bring it home. 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, let's do it. So we usually close off with 3 truths, in this case about addiction, 2 myths about addiction, and 1 thing anyone could do today to help with their addiction.
3 truths, 2 myths, and 1 action.
Yeah.
3, 2, 1. All right. Well, 3 truths about addiction is that it is a brain disease. It's not an issue of morality, will, choice, or personality flaws. Number 2, addiction is a very treatable condition, and you don't have to see the world's greatest experts to get response. You just have to see someone you connect with. Thirdly, the world of addiction is changing dramatically, absolutely, because of our smartphone devices and AI and the rapid rise of technology, meaning the needle, the syringe, and the content of the syringe are really delivered much faster to our brains than ever before. Two myths are, number one, I think that people with any type of addictive disorder don't get better. That's completely false. We know that recovery rates are about the same, if not better, than diabetes, obesity, or asthma. It's absolutely true that way. Number two, the other, I think, major myth is that people with addiction absolutely don't care. Let me back up. The other myth is that people with addiction have to hit, quote, rock bottom to get better. I mean, that's such a pejorative term, meaning you have to lose everything deliberately before you actually want to get help. No, I think the better term is that, again, people have to know how to access care and have the strength and courage to make that call rather than wait until things are so bad. And one action thing that everyone can do right now is, I think, in their lives, is to bake into, particularly in the gambling world, is to think, how do I want gambling and money around gambling to impact my household today? Do I want to think about it as an entertainment expenditure that should go in my budgets, like movies, sports, and theater? Or do I want to think about it as a means as a second job? So the real action for everyone in their household right now is to think about, how does gambling fit into your household budget? If I had a prevention T-shirt, it would say that for young people, gambling is not a reliable way of making money. Gambling is not a job. Gambling is not investment. Gambling is entertainment. And all forms of entertainment cost something, usually a little bit of money.
Yeah. Incredible. Where can people find you and follow your work?
So they can take a look at our website, uclagamblingprogram.org. I'm also available through just Googling UCLA Health, Dr. Timothy Fong. We have a state treatment program, or no-cost treatment for anyone concerned about their gambling or our family members.
Risk-free?
Risk-free. Well, risk-free treatment. We call it no-cost treatment, and it's available 1-800-GAMBLER, 1-800-GAMBLER, or they can go to problemgambling.ca.gov, problemgambling.ca.gov. And I'm on Twitter. I don't have a big Twitter presence at Fongster98, but it's there, along with the other 500 bots that are on my account, but people can reach me there as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it. This topic on addiction, specifically gambling addiction, was really illuminating to me personally. I'm honored to have sat next to you and talked about the topic, and thank you for all the work you've done thus far.
Thanks for having me.
Hopefully it'll continue.
This was awesome.
Great.
All right, everybody. Better Brain Podcast. Make sure, be better.